What is taking place in the market for smartphones? The purpose of this presentation is to examine the smartphone industry. We are going to see that this particular market is a changing marketplace. Not too long ago, the only smartphone on the market was the one offered by Apple, known as the iPhone. The iPhone was the dominant player, and Apple enjoyed monopoly power just for a short time until the Droid operating system became available and Samsung started offering high-end smartphones to rival those of Apple's. Economists refer to an industry dominated by a few players or a few producers as an oligopoly. Typically, there are 6 to 10 firms, each sharing a large segment of the market. The Samsung-Apple situation is a unique type of oligopoly called a duopoly, similar to the manner in which Coke and Pepsi share the market for cola. Samsung and Apple shared the market for high-end smartphones for a time. In order to maintain their dominant position as smartphone producers, both Samsung and Apple would need to create barriers to entry. One of the interesting aspects to this industry is that the barriers to entry have not been all that difficult for rivals to overcome, and new participants are making headway into this market. Typically, we use game theory to examine what's going on when there are only a few players. The idea that in an oligopoly there is mutual interdependence among the producers, which means they have to consider not only how their customers would react to a change in price of their product, but how their rivals would follow suit. This may not apply because of the new players in the smartphone market. One interesting mechanism to analyze the current situation in the smartphone market is to use what's actually occurring in the industry, and that is segmentation between high-end smartphones and lower-priced smartphones. The high-end smartphones offered by Samsung and Apple could be referred to as superior or normal goods. What's happening is that there's been, due to a decrease in taste and preferences for these particular offerings, a slight decrease in the demand for these products. Typically, a decrease in demand brings us from our current equilibrium at E1 with quantity 1 and price 1 to a new equilibrium with a lower quantity of phones bought and produced and a lower price. I'm quite certain most people have heard of Samsung and Apple. However, if we look at the names of these new producers of lower-end smartphones, Wiko, Micromax, Carbone, not exactly household names. It's almost unjust to call these new offerings inferior goods. However, they're only inferior in relation to the extremely expensive iPhone and Samsung offerings. What's been happening in this particular segment of the market, the lower end segment of the market, especially among people who are buying a smartphone for the first time, is that there's been an increase in the demand for these particular phones. Now, typically, we would expect that with an increase in demand that the equilibrium would change from E1 with price 1 and Q1 to E2 with a higher quantity and higher price for these phones in the market. Most definitely there is an increase in the quantity of these particular phones bought and sold. However, as we will explain later, price of these phones is not increasing because cost of production has not only dropped, it has tumbled, and it may continue to tumble for the foreseeable future. Wiko, Micromax, Carbone, the producers of these low-cost smartphones, these low-cost vendors, are most definitely changing the market. How are they changing the market? Well, they're producing a product by which people purchasing a new smartphone will actually pay less for a smartphone than they did for their old device. This is possible because, as referred to earlier, the cost of making smartphones has dropped dramatically. How do these low-cost vendors achieve such a low cost of production? Well, these producers simply buy standardized processors from chip designers. inside of your phone. Computer chips run the software and the hardware. Qualcomm from America, MediaTek out of Taiwan, Spreadtrum from China, and other chip makers globally produce these chips, and they are happy to sell these chips to the low-cost vendors making smartphones. Matter of fact, it's interesting because chip makers are scrapping furiously to provide in an ever-rising quality at ever lower prices of these particular chips, which are necessary to make the smartphones. Smartphones can be put together anywhere, and obviously one of the lowest places to manufacture anything on planet Earth currently is in China. So, in addition to the chips bought from the previously mentioned chip designers, low-cost phone vendors can choose cameras and screens and other pieces to include in the phones and simply churn out thousands upon thousands of phones in low-cost manufacturing facilities in China. Some interesting statistics is that last year shipments of smartphones priced below $80 more than quintupled, and devices at devices at under $100 made up 1/6 of the total market. This particular graph is quite telling. Look at the year 2011. All right, in that year, there were no offerings of smartphones labeled lower than $99. So if we see that grayish up top on the left, you can see phones costing less than $99. In 2011, that didn't even exist. By 2012, you see that a teeny segment of the market had shifted into this low-cost smartphone venue. And then by the year 2013, these low-cost phones are growing enormously. And if you just go one step up, phones costing between $100 and $200, that dark bluish segment on the graph, that segment is also growing and growing so quite substantially. So if we look at the lowest two pieces of these graphs, the gray and the dark blue, and you look at the forecast for 18, you notice that these low-cost phones will dominate the market in the not-so-distant future. It has not yet cost Apple. It may be starting to cost Samsung, something we will talk about later in the presentation. At this point, everyone should be familiar with our cost of production graphs and our curves which explain cost of production. Average fixed cost is simply the green curve here, your total fixed cost divided by quantity of output. Fixed costs are those which do not vary with the firm's level of output and are unavoidable. And then firms have variable costs like labor, utilities, raw materials. It's not so much the fixed costs which have decreased for the firm's cost of production scenario. It's these variable inputs which are dropping in price, and specifically the pieces of the puzzle, the chips and the other parts of the phone that need to be manufactured continue to drop. So in terms of these graphs, imagine as the price of chips and other pieces to the smartphone puzzle drop, these variable inputs, the average variable cost curve, the ABC curve, the yellow curve, will shift downwards. What this will do is bring down the marginal cost curve and also the average total cost curve. So as these cost curves shift downwards, producers are able to make more profits without raising prices and actually can lower prices. So what's happening in the smartphone industry in total? Well, at current rate, it seems as if we're headed for a divided market. The top tier phones still resembles that duopoly between Samsung and Apple referred to earlier. However, the bottom half of the market much more resembles monopolistic competition, maybe even something close to pure competition. So what you have is sort of highly priced smartphones versus inexpensive phones. It's interesting to say, okay, where is the market headed in the future? What's going to be the situation 5 years from now? Will the smartphone industry resemble monopolistic competition in the near future in total? Or will we have this continued divided market with high-end phones having a dominant position among those who are willing and able to purchase phones at significantly higher prices? Time will tell, but in 2012, 42% of phones priced at less than $80 had a processor faster than 1 gigahertz. Last year, that number jumped from 42% of phones all the way up to 87% of phones. And the proportion of cheap phones with screens more than 4 inches across went from less than 8% to 38%. 2 years ago, the median price of a smartphone was $325. Last year it was $250, and this year it actually may fall below $200, which means cheaper phones are still getting cheaper. It's going to be a question of, is good enough good enough? In other words, how much smartphone do you need, considering you can get a rather decent phone for a low price? Mozilla, which makes the Firefox web browser, it announced recently that it's actually going to start offering smartphones at a target price of $25. It plans on using Spreadtrum chips and buying materials for the phones from a host of different vendors. So what's going to happen as far as the Apples and Samsungs of the world? Apple may, for the time being, be a bit insulated because of its operating system and its brand loyalty. Samsung has suffered a bit more because Samsung has significantly high marketing costs, which these low-cost producers do not, and Samsung spends a good deal of money as far as cost in research and development, while these other companies simply put the pieces of the puzzle together after someone else has spent the time, energy, and of course cost of research and development.